to 1308 web series, Chapter 6, Cellular Respiration, Obtaining Energy from Food. Now this chapter 6, starts the second unit. And the second unit is all about how energy is processed. And the first one we're on in chapter 6 is called cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is found both in plants and animals. Now, the thing about cell respiration is that it implies that we're using oxygen. So it implies that we're using oxygen. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide. And on this slide, you'll see that it says glucose. And as you have been watching these lecture videos, you've noticed that I have said glucose many times. Glucose is the key energy source for the body. Now, the reason why this slide is provided by the publisher is because a 20% or so, some people say as much as 25%, 20 to 25% of the oxygen and 20 to 25% of the glucose that's in our blood is utilized by the brain. So the brain uses a lot of glucose, a lot of energy. Okay? So glucose, heavy with the brain. Now glucose has to be converted to ATP for the cell. So the cell cannot use glucose directly. The cell has to use ATP. And that's what this chapter is about. So how do we get glucose, which is a huge, big molecule, and how do we get it down to a point where the cell, a little tiny cell, can utilize it for energy in the form of ATP? Okay, next slide. Now this slide here says exactly what I said just a moment ago when I started off. I said this chapter will be all about how we burn using oxygen. Because cell respiration is basically a furnace. And when you are producing ATP, we are also going to produce carbon dioxide. We're going to produce water. And we're going to produce a lot of heat. And that's what this is all about. So again, you see oxygen present on this slide. Now, whenever you say oxygen is utilized, we use this term right here called aerobic. So by definition, when someone says it uses oxygen, it's referring to the fact that it is aerobic. Okay? So by definition, aerobic means that we're utilizing oxygen. And when we exercise, we use a lot of oxygen. And when we are a couch potato and not doing much, then we're using less oxygen. But of course, we're also burning less energy also. So when we are burning more energy, we're utilizing more of the oxygen, we're producing more carbon dioxide, more water, more heat, all during this process. The next slide. So here's a picture of someone running. Next slide. Okay. Now this slide right here gives you the opposite. If we are exercising to a point where we're not breathing well, then we convert ourselves over to anaerobic. And when we are not breathing well or we don't have enough oxygen getting to our cells to properly burn glucose, remember I said we're like a furnace. So to burn glucose, if we're not doing that properly, then we're going to be in an anaerobic mode. And that's what we see here in the paragraph, anaerobic. And when we're in anaerobic, we're not producing the usual products. Instead, we're producing a byproduct, what we don't like, and that is lactic acid. And as you can see by the slide, it's a very inefficient process. So when we're in anaerobic, then we're not producing the usual products, we're not breaking down glucose properly, and we're producing what's called lactic acid. And lactic acid takes about 48 hours to process by the liver. Now that would be a good test question later on. So it's important that you keep that in mind, that lactic acid is produced in the muscles when we are anaerobic, and it takes about 48 hours for the liver to process that lactic acid. So when someone says they exercise overly and they're really exhausted, and now when they run, they got a lot of muscle pain. Well, that muscle pain is coming from the lactic acid. It's that ache that you get if you are not properly exercising. Okay, so if you're not properly breathing. So lactic acid takes about 48 hours for the liver to process. Next slide. Okay, now this slide I'm going to stop on because we're going to go carefully on this one. It says here, all life requires energy. And as we said in a previous chapter, that we're getting the original energy from the sun. No sun, no animals, no plants, nothing. Now, we also see here that the author's giving a hint about what plants do during photosynthesis. And what you're going to discover in a next chapter or a future chapter is that cell respiration produces carbon dioxide and water. That's what cell respiration produces, carbon dioxide and water. In a future chapter, when we talk about photosynthesis, you're going to see that it's the other way around. In photosynthesis, the plants use carbon dioxide, they use water to produce the glucose and the sugars. So that's what plants do. And that's where we get our energy from, the plants. Okay. All right, so photosynthesis will be a complete opposite of what cell respiration is. I think that's even one of my clinical questions. So if by random chance that's assigned to you, you know you got a question relating to that. Okay, so photosynthesis is the opposite of cell respiration. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we have two kinds. Now we saw a slide similar to this in our chapter 1, chapter 2 stuff, but here it is as a repeat. So this time you definitely need to know it. So here we have plants. Plants are autotrophs. That means they are self-feeders. They provide their own energy for themselves and for us as animals. Okay, so autotrophs, and that's what they produce their own energy. We do not make our own energy. We simply use energy from the plants and the surrounding. And in this picture, you see exactly what I said a moment ago. The plants are using carbon dioxide and water, the same carbon dioxide, the same water that we actually produce. So we produce water, we produce carbon dioxide, and that's what the plant actually uses. Okay. Then at the bottom, we have heterotrophs. That's what we are. We are heterotrophs, other feeders, meaning that we don't make our own energy. We use energy from outside source. So humans and other animals, we don't make our own organic stuff. We don't make glucose on our own. We have to get it from somewhere. So heterotrophs. Okay, this is always a test question somewhere. So you should know what are autotrophs and what are heterotrophs. So plants are autotrophs. We, animals and humans, are heterotrophs. Next slide. Okay. Very similar is the term we saw earlier, producers. So plants are producers, and we saw that in a previous chapter. So plants are producers. Heterotrophs, like animals, like us, we are consumers. Okay, so very similar to our previous chapter. So here's a picture of a koala and eucalyptus leaves. Well, the eucalyptus leaves are the producers, and the koala here is your consumer. Okay, next slide. Again, we see this. Now, this one is not a really great slide in terms of picture because there isn't a picture, it's words. But you'll see on the next slide that it is going to be all about the cell respiration and photosynthesis. And remember, they are opposites of each other. So they're opposites. So for photosynthesis, we said already several times that photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide, takes in water, and it produces the glucose for us. Okay. It also produces the oxygen gas. And I'm sure people know that oxygen actually comes from photosynthesis. So if you didn't know that, that was very important. Photosynthesis is what provides the oxygen. So the air that we breathe is coming from the photosynthesis plants. Okay, so oxygen. Next slide. This picture is one that's very important. You will see it several times. This picture shows you the carbon dioxide, the water going into photosynthesis, making the glucose for us, making the oxygen for us, and then we as animals, we take in the glucose, we take in the oxygen, we produce ATP by way of cell respiration. That's what this chapter is about. And we also said in the previous chapter that we also produce heat. So we're also producing heat. Okay. Next slide. So this slide is very, very important picture-wise. Okay. All right. The author says the same thing again, so I'm going to skip this one. Again, we're now talking about cell respiration this time, where we use oxygen to produce these things. And yes, the plants and animals do eventually end up making ATP. And if you remember from your flashcard suggestion on the cell for both animal cell and plant cell from the previous chapter, we said that the mitochondria is where ATP is produced. That's a very important test question. So where is ATP produced? In the mitochondria. So the mitochondria produces ATP. And when it comes to cell respiration, as we saw in our pictures already, the end products or the waste products of cell respiration are carbon dioxide and water. The very same thing that photosynthesis actually uses. Okay, next slide. Hang on. Now, for plants, the plants also have to have some type of production to make stuff. So that's where plants use what we provide, the sugars that they make. The sugars that they make go into the plant. So when you eat potatoes, that's actually a starch that the potatoes have that is stored. So the plants make potatoes, right? Potatoes come from a plant. Yes, underground, but still from a plant. Well, those potatoes have starch, and that is how they are storing their energy. So potatoes are actually a storage form of starch for the plant. Okay, next slide. Okay, we've seen these many, many times. These are just reviews. Okay, now comes this picture. Again, the author repeats himself many, many times. So this is letting you know that cell respiration is definitely what? Aerobic. So cell respiration is definitely aerobic. And yes, cell respiration implies oxygen is present. Oxygen is present. And it turns out that that oxygen is very, very important to us because it does something inside of the cell that we're going to see later in this chapter. So the oxygen is very, very important. And then, of course, what is the waste product? Carbon dioxide is the waste product. Okay, here's a picture of a runner. This person is breathing. And as they're breathing, they're taking in the oxygen. They're blowing out the carbon dioxide. And inside of the cell respiration of the muscle, and muscles have a lot of mitochondria. Why would you assume that muscles have a lot of mitochondria? Because muscles need a lot of ATP energy. Makes sense. So a lot of ATP energy there. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a repeat, don't care. Okay, this formula you do need to memorize. You do need to memorize. Now it says C6H12O6. That is the formula for glucose. So C6H12O6. Remember the hexagon shape that I mentioned in a previous chapter. So this hexagon shape, this green one, is the glucose, C6H12O6. Then we have oxygen that we breathe in, and that gets converted to carbon dioxide and water, and then it makes ATP. Now, if you paid attention to my videos, I said that ATP is about 36 ATPs. Here it says 32. Now, I'm not wrong, nor is the book. It all depends. And if you remember how I said it the first time, when I said one glucose is about 36 ATPs, because it depends upon the process. So if you go through one process, you're going to get less ATP. If you go through a different process, you're going to get a little bit more ATP. For purposes of the test, and I will not play tricks on this for the test, nor will the department exam, because it's beyond the scope of this class. But it's approximately 32, 34, or 36 ATPs depending on the process. So 32, 34, 36, depending on the process. Okay, now this is where it gets complicated. Here is where you need to know the next picture that's coming up. So if you're not studying the pictures, which as you can see, I spend a lot of time on pictures, this is where the picture is going to be important. So here we have a slide that says cell respiration is broken down into 3 steps. The first step is called glycolysis. The second step is called citric acid cycle. Now, many people, even to this day, will use another term for citric acid cycle called the Krebs cycle. So if you took high school biology and you remember some of that, you'll see that the citric acid cycle is the same as Krebs cycle. We use it interchangeably, unknowingly at times. So citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle. Then below that, we have the electron transport chain. That's what it's called, electron transport chain. Each one of these stages is at a different location inside of the cell. So each one of these is at a different location. And when I go to the next slide and the next few slides, you'll see that that is where the importance comes into play. So each one of these steps has a different function and they're at different locations within the cell. Next slide. Okay, here's our picture. On this picture, we see the first step called glycolysis. Now, the purpose of glycolysis is to break down glucose into another structure, and that structure is called pyruvic acid. Some people call it pyruvate. Unknowingly, again, people will change it over to the other term, pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Now, what you're really doing, if you haven't really figured out, is that we're taking glucose, which is a big molecule, and we're breaking it apart. And as we break it apart, we're going to actually break the elements apart. So let me go back and explain that with this picture. Here we have glucose again, the picture we saw a moment ago. And it has 6 carbons in it. And it has 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. Now, that carbon there, that carbon is eventually going to become this carbon as part of carbon dioxide. So Nimish, are you saying that we're breaking this thing apart in a chemical way that eventually the carbon that's in here, 6 of those, gives us the 6 carbon dioxides that we see here with 6 carbons? That's exactly what I'm saying. So eventually everything has to even out. So 6 carbons here eventually makes it 6 carbons here because we have 6 carbon dioxides for every 1 glucose that we actually burn. And I'm using burn because don't we burn things with oxygen? A fire requires what? Oxygen. That's why when we're aerobic, we get hot. We get hot when we're aerobic because we're producing heat, because we're burning like a furnace. Okay? So this 6 carbon will eventually become these 6 over here for carbon dioxide. But in order to do that, we have to break glucose down in steps. And by each step that we break down, notice we're releasing some amount of ATP. We're slowly taking the energy out. We can't do it in one big bang. If we do that, it would be like a rocket that takes off, where all the big heavy-duty explosion takes place at once, and then there's no energy thereafter. So we can't have a rocket type of ATP production. We have to take that glucose and slowly release the energy, like a slow burn. And that's what we're doing here. So in glycolysis, we are converting glucose to 2 pyruvic acids. So there's 2 of those. So glucose gets converted to 2 pyruvic acids. And yes, we make ATP. Now, before I go any further, you need to understand that glucose to pyruvate, this glycolysis, is anaerobic. Okay, is anaerobic. Let me say that again. So this glycolysis process from glucose to pyruvate or pyruvic acid is anaerobic. And by definition, anytime anything is anaerobic, of course, without oxygen, it means that it produces very little ATP. Remember I said the slow burn. This is about 2 ATPs. Later on, we'll actually see a picture that tallies it for us. But right now, just keep a mental note that glycolysis, being anaerobic, produces only 2 ATPs, very little. Now, where am I? Remember I said you need to know where you are in the cell because they're in different locations. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. So glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, then once you are done making pyruvate or pyruvic acid, notice it says 2 of them. So what happens by the author's example is that the author will take 1 of the pyruvic acids and make it go through this cycle. But keep in mind, because we have 2 of them, this entire cycle that I'll explain later actually happens twice. So we are actually running through this citric acid cycle twice. Once for the first pyruvic acid, 1 time around the circle, and then the second time around the circle for the second pyruvic acid. So remember, we have 2 of them, so we have to go through this cycle twice. Now, if you notice carefully that we have now moved into the mitochondria. So we are in one portion of the mitochondria for the citric acid cycle. Again, I'm giving you an overview and then we'll look at the individual pictures. So now the pyruvic acid or the pyruvate has gone into the citric acid cycle. Remember, we have 2 pyruvics, so we're going to go around this circle twice. Now, we're in the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, we are now in the mitochondria. Now, it too is not going to make a lot of ATP. Again, about 2 ATPs. So again, we're only making 2 ATPs. Now, let me backtrack real quick. We saw glucose in our formula here. Let me show the formula again. We saw glucose having 6 carbons. But when I go to this pyruvate only has 3 carbons. And we'll see that in a later picture. It only has 3. So what we're doing is we're breaking up glucose into 2 pieces. And pyruvate has only 3 carbons. And the other pyruvate, because remember we have 2 of them, has also only 3 carbons. And what we're doing is as we break the glucose up further and further, we're releasing electrons. So in this picture here, it says high energy electrons. So we're taking the glucose, the C6H12O6, we're breaking glucose down into 3 carbon glucose or 3 carbon structures, and here we call them pyruvates. We're breaking them down, and then we're going to release the electrons. So Nimish, where are the true energy? The true energy is in the electrons, and that's why it says high energy electrons. But we can't have them free floating because that's dangerous. So what we want to have is a carrier, like a chaperone, that's actually carrying the electrons. And what I'm doing now with this picture is giving you a nice overview, and then we'll see the individual pieces. So the citric acid cycle's job, again, not a lot of ATP, only 2 ATPs. But it is breaking the glucose apart, stripping it of electrons, and something called a carrier is holding on to these electrons. And the energy is in the electrons. And we have two kinds of carriers that we'll see in a moment. And those two, by name, one's called NADH, and the other one is called FADH2. And we'll see these electron carriers. And they're actually holding on to them. That's where most of the energy is. And then eventually we get to the last stage. It's called electron transport chain. That's in a different area of the mitochondria. And notice the size of the ATP down here. See how it's much bigger than the other two. So I told you that glycolysis produces only 2 ATPs. I also told you that the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, only produces 2 ATPs. But then the electron transport chain will produce about 32 ATPs. So if Nemish adds up 32 plus 2 plus 2, so that's 32, 36, right? So 34, so 32, 34, and then another 2, 36. And that's how Nemish gave you that comment earlier about one glucose making about 36 ATP. And the math comes this way. 32 ATPs from electron transport chain, another 2 from here, that makes it 34, and another 2 from glycolysis, that makes it 36. So if the process works at a certain way, you'll get up to a total of 36 ATPs. But most of it is coming from the electron transport chain, 32 ATP. Okay, moving on. Okay, I've already given you the comment. All I'm now showing you are the words that go with it. So the citric acid cycle is also called the Krebs cycle. And the reason I'm showing you the slide is I said it orally. I want to show you where I got it from. So citric acid cycle is also called the Krebs cycle. Okay, next slide. All right, now again, I don't want you to write all of this down because it's bogus to do so. But remember I told you the name of the two types of electron carriers. Here the author calls it a shuttle, same thing. So one of the carriers is called NADH. It's actually like holding on to the electrons. And those electrons are high energy electrons. It says it right there, carrying the high energy electrons. It's the electrons that is going to help us with the energy. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here it is, NADH, again with the energy. And this slide is summarizing the third step that I gave you a moment ago, which is the electron transport chain. And that's the one that produces the most ATP, 32 ATP. Again, we are making what? ATP in the end. Next slide. Okay, now here the author says the same thing. We're producing what? We're producing 32 ATPs. And notice it says overall 32, but remember, depending on the process, it can be up to 36. And we already know that we use glucose and oxygen, and we always produce carbon dioxide, water, and heat. The author is always ignoring heat, but we should not ignore it. Okay? All right, we shouldn't ignore it. And the bottom here, where the little instructors, little teaching tip down here, the bottom that you see that I often cut off, we are warm-blooded animals. Why are we warm-blooded? We're warm-blooded because of this process. So to stay warm, you have to have this process going on in your body. Okay, next slide. Okay. All right, these are now the details. Again, I don't like slides just like this, so we're going to do it in picture form, and that's the next slide. Now, you know that when we run a business, what's that motto of a business? You got to put money in to get money out, right? That's the motto in business. You got to invest in the company in order to make the money. Well, in the same storyline here, we see glycolysis. Now, what the author's doing now is going through each of those steps individually. And I will too. Okay, so this slide is talking about glycolysis. Now, glycolysis has glucose going in. And remember where we are. And that's one of the questions I will be asking on a test, and the department will too. They'll ask you, where do these things take place? And glycolysis, as we saw in an earlier picture, that's why I'm a big fan of pictures, glycolysis took place in the cytoplasm. So if you ignore pictures or if you're not watching the lecture videos, you're missing out on a lot of tips for the test. That is exactly what previous students have said. Those who paid attention to the lecture videos or to lectures in person when we had the in-person classes, those who paid attention, who followed up by looking at the pictures, they made very good grades. Those who didn't watch the videos, didn't pay attention, they didn't. So that is because a simple question like this, where does glycolysis take place? In the cytoplasm. So you can't afford to miss a question like that. Now, glycolysis, as we said, is taking place in the cytoplasm. Here's our glucose. They're showing it to you in 6-carbon format here, like a little stick figure way. So 6 carbons. Notice we are putting 2 ATPs in. Like I said in the business example, you got to put money in to get money out. So in this case, we're investing 2 ATPs going in. Okay, so 2 ATPs going in. But then, as we see, we're making it into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And if you recall, pyruvic acid is only 3 carbons. So 1, 2, 3. And then, of course, we're making 2 of them. So 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom. And again, we're making 2 ATPs in this process, another 2 ATPs in this process. But Nemish, a moment ago, you told me that glycolysis only produces 2 ATPs. Well, if you do the math here, a simple math, you put 2 in, you got 4 out, right? So you invested 2, but you made 4. So the net, the overall, is still what? 2 ATPs. So that's why I said earlier, how many ATPs come from glycolysis? Only 2 ATPs. Yes, we put 2 in, but we got 4 out, so the net is only 2 ATPs. So we have only 2 ATPs overall from this process. And yes, we're making 2 pyruvic acids. 1 at the top, 3 carbons, 1 at the bottom, 3 carbons. And each one of these will now go through the Krebs cycle. And as it goes through the Krebs cycle, remember we have 2 of them. So we have to go through the cycle twice. That is important to remember when we do our summing up of the numbers. We're going to go through that cycle twice. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the author's now starting the citric acid cycle. I don't like this slide, so we're going to do a picture. And here's the picture version. So a moment ago, we saw one of these on the last slide. One of those 3 carbons pyruvates. And now we're going to go through this thing called the Krebs cycle. Again, it's in a not circular fashion. It's like a flat version, but it does give me the same thing. Now, this is the starting point. So what we do is we again break off a carbon. And when breaking off a carbon, we have carbon dioxide. Yes, this is one of the carbon dioxides that we produce. Now remember, overall, we're going to have 6 carbon dioxides. How do I know? Because when I went to this picture earlier, we saw that we have a total of 6 carbon dioxides. 6 carbon dioxides. And at the moment, in the picture we're currently on, here, we see only 1. But remember, this process is done for both of the pyruvic acids. So we're going to double this number. So we're going to have at this step 2 carbon dioxide so far. So we know that somehow, somewhere, we're still owed another 4 carbon dioxide somewhere. So this is going to be here producing 1 carbon dioxide, but since we have 2 of these, we're going to end up with 2 carbon dioxide so far. And keep in mind, we still have 4 more somewhere else produced. Then we have this stage. This is like an intermediate stage. And this is going to be creating something called a coenzyme A attached to something called acetyl-CoA. So coenzyme A attached to something called acetyl. Now notice how many carbons I now have. Only 2 carbons. So only 2 carbon structure here. So only 2 carbon structure. Remember, one of those went to make carbon dioxide for one pyruvate, and then the other pyruvate, one of them went away also. So we ended up so far with a sum of 2 carbon dioxides out of the 6 total. Then over here, this thing goes through a loop. So that's what we're going to go through now. So that's what actually enters the cycle. What enters the cycle is something called acetyl coenzyme A. That's what this thing is. It's only a 2 carbon structure, and it's a acetyl coenzyme A, and that goes into this cycle. Remember now, we have 2 times we go around this thing. One time and then the second time. Now let's do that math over here on the right. If I double every one of these things, so let's double them. Because remember, I'm going around this cycle twice. So instead of 2 carbon dioxides, that's going to give me 4 carbon dioxides. And now it makes sense, because in this previous step, we had, not that one, this one. In this one, the one pyruvate made 1 carbon dioxide. The second pyruvate made the second carbon dioxide. That gave us 2 over there. And then when we go through this Krebs cycle twice, we get 2 times this. That gives me my remaining 4 carbon dioxides. So the 4 carbon dioxides here, the 2 carbon dioxides from this step gives us our 6 carbon dioxides. So yes, we are accounting for all of this in these steps. So we now have 6 carbon dioxides as promised. We got 2 carbon dioxides from here because we have 2 of these, so that's going to give us 2 of those, so 2 carbon dioxides. And then we went through the Krebs cycle and we got 4 carbon dioxides, so that gives us our 6. So that's tallied. Then, what did Nima say about the Krebs cycle? How much ATP do I make from the Krebs cycle? And that was from this picture that I was going over. When I went over this picture, I told you that we have only 2 ATPs here. 2. All right, so if I tally that, you see that, remember, we're going around this circle twice, so that's going to give us our 2 ATPs. And that tallies correctly as well. Then, down here, these 2 are the electron carriers. First time we're seeing them. Now, I did mention NADH, and in my previous discussion, I also mentioned FADH2 just a few slides back. Again, we're going to double these. So I'm going to have 6 NADH, so 6 of those, because I got to double all this. And then I'm going to have 2 FADH2s. So those are the electron carriers. These are the carriers that are going to go into the last step, called the electron transport chain. Okay, so moving on. Don't care for this one. Don't care for this one. Okay, this one's somewhat nice, but I've found that this one actually confuses people, so I'm not going to mention that. I'm not going to go to that one either. That confuses people. Now, this one I do care for. Now, this picture here is showing us what oxygen does for us. Remember, we're breathing oxygen. When we go through the electron transport chain, the electrons that we are holding on NADH, because it's holding, it's a transport, it's a shuttle, and we're using it to carry it. Then, as we go down the electron transport chain, and we have not seen that picture yet, when we go down the electron transport chain, we slowly release the electrons, and we'll see what that looks like in a moment. When we slowly release them, we make ATP. But then we have 1 electron left over, that final electron. And on a test, the magic test question is, who is the final electron acceptor? And the final electron acceptor is oxygen. Yes, it's the same oxygen that we breathe. So it's the same oxygen that we breathe. And that oxygen and the electron that it carried gave it the energy to make H2O. So yes, we do make water in our body. And we make water in our body this way. From the oxygen that we breathe, which is holding on to that final energy electron, just enough to join hydrogen and oxygen together to make water. So yes, we do make water in our cells. We need water, so we make water as well. It's a very, very tiny amount, but it's in the cell. And that's how we make water. Remember, the products were carbon dioxide, water, and heat. And that's how we make the water. So in the previous slide that I keep coming back to, this one, that's where the water came from. So that's where the water came from. Okay, going back to where we are. So we're on this slide. So again, we take out a lot of energy, but there's one little electron left over, and that is picked up by the final electron acceptor, which is oxygen. Absolutely a test question. So who is the final electron acceptor? Oxygen. What does it do with that electron? Gives it enough energy to join with hydrogen to make H2O. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a picture I'm just putting up to show you that there are two sides or two different membranes within the mitochondria. That's going to be important from the key last picture that I'm going to show you here. That's very, very important. Okay, here's a slide. I'm skipping this one because it won't make sense until I show you a picture. So again, I'm a big picture guy. So here is what we are at. We're at the electron transport chain now. And notice the mitochondria is where we are, and we have two parts to the mitochondria, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And that's what we're seeing right now, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. And here's how this story works. Over here, we see NADH holding on to our electrons. So NADH holding on to our electrons. We also see FADH2 holding on to our electrons. Now, over here, we see these things. These are our membrane proteins. Okay, these are our membrane proteins, these purple things, membrane proteins. And they're embedded in this layer here, this membrane. So we have an outside and an inside. And what we're doing here is we're using the electrons to move hydrogen. So they're acting like a pump. We're using it as a pump. So what we're doing is we're moving these hydrogen ions to the other side. And see how there's a whole lot of hydrogen ions up here. So yes, we're using the energy of the electrons to move the hydrogen to this upper level up here, to this level. Now, if you know what a dam does, a dam holds water back and makes a big reservoir. And then the water's only allowed to come through a certain way that turns a turbine, and that's how we make electricity. So if you've ever been to Las Vegas, a lot of the electricity is actually coming from the nearby Hoover Dam near Henderson, Las Vegas area. And so Henderson, Nevada. And so that's where Hoover Dam is, and Hoover Dam is holding back a lake called Lake Mead. And Lake Mead has several channels that go through, so water only goes through these little turbines. And as the turbines turn, they produce a motor effect, an electromotor effect, and that creates electricity. Okay, just like the bicycles. If you ever had a little bicycle as a kid that had a little generator attached to the wheel, so as the wheel turned, it created the generator that turned the little light bulb on, so then you had a little light beam hit, like a headlight beam coming from your bicycle. Same idea, like a little generator, and that's what this is. So if you look on the far right, you actually see what looks like a generator, like a little turbine. And you can see how it's spinning here. This spinning thing is called ATP synthase. Yes, it's a membrane protein, so this is made out of a protein. And this ATP synthase spins. And as it spins, it actually takes ADP, joins it with phosphate. So we're using energy basically to join these two to make ATP. Now, how do we get the energy though? Up here are all these hydrogen ions that want to go down from high to low, just like water. Water likes to pour from high to low. You don't see water going from low to high, like against gravity, but you see water going with the gravity from a high elevation to a lower elevation, right? So that's what this is doing. It's going from high concentration. So we have a high concentration of hydrogen, and it's going to go down this pump. And it's called a pump because it's an ATP pump, and it's an ATP synthase. It makes ATP. And you can see the hydrogen ions going through this turbine. And as it goes through the turbine, it turns and spins, and it joins these two to make ATP. And again, we saw over here a little skull and crossbone kind of thing. And that's to show you that the electrons are actually moving down this pipe. And it's the electrons that are actually moving the hydrogen ions to this higher concentration. So the electrons are used to move to the higher concentration. And then the last electron, that's why we see the skull and crossbone, the last electron is picked up by oxygen, mentioned in the previous slide. Oxygen picks it up, joins with the remaining hydrogen, and that's how we make water. And at the very bottom it says skull and crossbones are drawn beside the final electron acceptor, which is in this case oxygen. And that is going to drive to make water at the end. Okay, next slide. Now, my expectation is what we just went over is that you go over it again. Okay, this is not something that you can possibly pick up the first time around. So it's nice to go over it. And how are you going to ensure that you understood it? That's where the publisher materials. So the hotshots of the past, that's what they actually did. Now, how do I know they did it? Because they are the ones who actually did the publisher material. So they did the homeworks and the quizzes that go to ensure that you understand this. So those who did the publisher material, the homework and quizzes, remember they don't count for a grade, but they're there for you so that you ensure that you do well on the exams. And that's how they did it. All right. Now, remember I said there's going to be a chart that tallies all of this? Well, that's this chart right here. This chart is going to tally it all. So we've got 2 ATPs from glycolysis, as we've already said, 2 ATPs. Then we put it in the acetyl-CoA, which goes into the Krebs cycle. And again, as we do that, we are actually making more and more electrons stored as NADH. And in the citric acid cycle, we also have a few stored as FADH2. And again, the Krebs cycle only makes 2 ATPs. And then we have the electron transport chain that makes the most ATP. And then here the author says about 32, depending upon whether you're storing more as NADH or more as FADH2. And that's how you get to somewhere between 32 and 36 ATPs. So 32 to 36 ATPs, depending upon how it's processed. Okay, so that's key to keep in mind. Okay, next, I don't care for that. Now notice the author says the same thing I've been saying. Respiration is like a furnace. You're actually burning these things. So you're actually burning them. Now, have you ever wondered how they come up with how many calories something has? Well, they actually put it in a little contraption called a calorimeter. And they measure how much it takes to raise the temperature of the water that's in that device by 1 degree Celsius. And that's what a calorie is. A calorie is really a measure of how much energy it takes to change the temperature of the water by 1 degree Celsius. That's what a calorie is. So a calorie is the amount of energy it takes to raise the temperature of water by 1 degree Celsius. So when we eat our foods, no matter what we take in, whether it's a carbohydrate that we take in, a fat, like an oily thing we take in, or proteins, one way or the other, they all turn into glucose. So glucose will be glucose. The fats will eventually turn into glucose. The amino acids, proteins can also be used and to convert over to glucose. Not a good thing, because then that means your muscles are wasting away. But yes, you can have amino acids also turn into glucose. But notice the process always starts off with glycolysis, which is glucose. Okay, so one way or the other, you have to start with glucose. And that's what this picture is for me. That's what it serves as a value to let you know that no matter what form the carbohydrate, fat, protein, energy is, one way or the other, it turns into glucose. Okay, that's a repeat. Okay, now comes this one. Now we're going to look at fermentation. And there's 2 forms of fermentation. Now, all fermentation is anaerobic. So right off the bat, you've already learned something. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So fermentation is without oxygen. It's anaerobic. And also something I taught you earlier is if it's anaerobic, it will produce very little ATP. So that's by default, because fermentation is only going to be using glycolysis. Okay, so if fermentation is only using glycolysis, it's anaerobic. So fermentation is only using glycolysis, so it's anaerobic. Okay, next slide. Not that one, this one. Now this one is in muscles. So this one is in muscles. So if you're using your muscles, but you're not getting enough oxygen in, so the muscles are starving because you're not breathing right or you're not getting enough oxygen to your muscles, then what's going to happen is the muscles are going to stay in glycolysis, produce very little ATP. So it's going to stay in glycolysis, produce very little ATP, and produce lactic acid. And lactic acid, as I said, burns. And that burn is going to last until about 48 hours because it takes the liver about 48 hours to process this lactic acid. Okay, so that's important for a test. Okay, don't care. Here's the experiment that somebody did, again, dealing with lactic acid. So notice here, here's a muscle working, and they say that lactic acid came out. Okay, so lactic acid. But if you have enough oxygen, enough energy, then it'll last longer. Okay, so that's what that is. Okay, all right, next slide. Don't care. Don't care. Okay, now comes the other kind of fermentation. This fermentation is going to produce ethyl alcohol. That's how you make the beer and the wine type of thing. So this form of fermentation, and this one is using yeast. That's why beer and wine use yeast in the process. So beer and wine will use yeast in the process. And that yeast is producing fermentation. So yes, you have to use microorganisms. Some people use bacteria of some form, some use yeast, but they're going to ferment, and that fermentation produces alcohol. And that's what this next slide is. So again, it's glycolysis. Again, only 2 ATPs, but this time we see carbon dioxide and alcohol. So when you make bread, don't you have bread through fermentation? Don't you use yeast to raise the bread? Well, when you're using yeast to raise the bread, that's how you're getting the holes in the bread. Same is true for cheese. When you're making cheese, those big holes that you see in certain forms of cheese are due to the carbon dioxide gas breaking holes in the cheese. So you produce carbon dioxide and you produce alcohol. Okay, next slide. I don't care. This is just a timeline. I really don't care for this slide. I hardly ever ask it. Same is true for the department. This is just to let you know that before oxygen existed on the planet, before plants could produce oxygen, we sort of lived in an anaerobic kind of world. And then once we started making oxygen, making organisms, that's where we came around. So as you can see, eukaryotes did not exist until oxygen-making organisms came around, such as certain bacteria that can produce oxygen, and then eventually we came with plants, and then we came along as thereafter. Okay, next slide. Same thing as I just said here, summarized. So early on, it was the anaerobic kind of living creatures. Once we had animals that could produce oxygen, then we started having plants, and then we came along thereafter. All right, so strongly suggest for this chapter, chapter 6, that you go over it carefully with a fine-tooth comb, especially the pictures. Now, here's why this warning has been stressed early, this caution. If you understand cell respiration from chapter 6, you're going to better understand chapter 7 and 8 that go with photosynthesis. Why? Because it's pretty much the opposite process. So that's why it's so important that if you understand cell respiration, it'll help you understand the other 2 chapters of that unit. All right, you're ready to move on to chapter 7.